My guest overcame depression, a suicide attempt, and a brain injury to become a writer, a brain health blogger, and a well-known voice in the mental health community. She's the author of 2 books, including her memoir, Sex, Suicide, and Serotonin, which is an awesome name, I got to say. Her name is Debbie Hampton. Debbie, how are you?
I'm good, Jimmy. Thanks. Glad to be here.
For sure. It's a pleasure to talk to you. And I thought your story was really interesting. I think that you are an example of what is a more widespread problem than people might think, you know, especially during the COVID era when everybody's locked down at home. You were a wife and a mother, and you dealt with depression. And on your website, thebestbrainpossible.com, this is a reference that you wrote. You said, years of wrong turns, things not working out, and being flat out disappointed with life is what contributed to your depression. Talk to me a little bit about that time and about your state of mental health at that time.
Well, I'll give you the cliff notes. I had a pretty normal middle-class upbringing in the 60s and 70s. I had intelligent, well-meaning parents, but as was typical at that time, they were not incredibly emotionally intelligent. So that didn't get passed on to me because we learned those things from our parents and our environments. So I had 0 coping skills, and I learned to be dramatic with my reactions and to catastrophize and to think black or white. And there were quite a few successful suicides in my family. My grandfather, his father, my cousin. So when you see suicide in your family, that becomes a suggestion. I mean, it becomes a reality. My answer to life's hardships, to my high school boyfriend breaking up with me or anything, was to try to commit suicide. And of course, that didn't work very well. And it's not an adequate coping skill. But I married the high school boyfriend after college and after being together for 6 years. And we proceeded to follow his career moving around the US. And as he became bigger and kind of more out there in the world and more successful, I kind of shrunk. Like I said, I became a stay-at-home mom, and I proceeded to have 2 kids. And by that time, I was more than happy to just stay at home and kind of be the mother and the homemaker. I'd never really gone anywhere in my career. I'd always let him take precedence. And in between my 2 sons being born, my closest friend in the world, my brother, who was 10 months older than me, got AIDS or became sick with AIDS. He had AIDS for years. And this was back in the first wave of the epidemic of AIDS, when we didn't really even know what caused it at first. And then we weren't sure how it spread or anything. Mm. And there wasn't a whole lot we could do to help him. And at the time, I lived in Florida, but I would travel to his house in Atlanta with a toddler. My oldest son was less than a year old, and his porta crib and all his stuff. And I would stay for weeks at a time taking care of my brother. And as anybody knows, that's a caretaker. That will completely wear you out emotionally and physically. And I had a baby and my brother. Plus, I mean, all the grief that is attached with watching someone die and feeling helpless that you can't do anything. So after taking care of him for 2 years, he did die. And people may relate to this, but I was kind of actually relieved when he did die because he wasn't suffering anymore. And I don't know, it kind of was a peaceful ending to a horrible situation. But I went on with my life. I mean, they tell you your life goes on, and it does, but they don't tell you how to go on. So I had another son. By this time, I think I'd been married like 16 years. So the marriage was beginning to not be healthy. My ex-husband, as he grew in power, became a controlling narcissist. And as I said before, I shrunk. And then my brother's death and all that stress. I mean, I just became incredibly depressed. And my ex was somewhat emotionally abusive. And the marriage lasted 2 more years, 18 years. And I divorced him and moved to North Carolina with my sons. And that, a divorce after 18 years in itself is a huge loss, a huge death, and more grief, more depression. So when after about a year or so, and another boyfriend cheated on me, my ex-husband had, I said, screw it, I'm out of here. And I tried to kill myself with some pills because, as I said, I had no coping skills. And that was my answer to hardship. And I didn't kill myself, obviously, but I managed to give myself a serious brain injury. I was in a coma for a week. And when I woke up, I was severely impaired. I couldn't speak. I couldn't walk. I had very little memory. I didn't know I'd been divorced. I didn't know my second son had been born. So the next years were a process of recovering from the brain injury, from the emotional wounds, from the depression, mentally, spiritually, and emotionally. And the brain injury was although I would never, ever advise it, to me, it was kind of a blessing in disguise because it forced me to start over. And it wiped out a lot of the pathways in my brain that were negative, that were painful, that the habitual patterns that I had established of torturing myself. And that is what depression and grief is like. In a way, it becomes a pattern, and it becomes a way of viewing the world and relating to the world and thinking and being.
That's good. Well, first off, I'm glad that your attempt was not successful.
Me too.
And that you're still here. Now, I understand. So you talked about how you suffered the brain injury from that incident, and your ex-husband took custody of your kids and you had to undergo rehab. I understand, though, that your turnaround in terms of your mental well-being didn't happen right after all of that. It happened as a result of a trip to Hawaii. And from what I understand, you went to Hawaii, you went swimming, you realized you couldn't swim as well as you used to because you were dealing with this brain injury. And then something happened on that trip, and that's what kind of led to your new positive outlook. Tell me a little bit about what happened in Hawaii.
Well, that trip was what they call the aha moment. I mean, it was the realization that I had control over my mind and that I had been habitually torturing myself. I was growing up, I was a really good swimmer. I swam competitively, and I was a lifeguard all through high school and college. So I was a good swimmer. But after the brain injury, I wasn't so good because a brain injury affects your coordination and your muscles and your breathing, your ability to close your throat, or it can. And it did for me. So I went to Hawaii with my other brother. And because my ex had taken my kids away and I was brain injured, we just did it. I think he did it as to give me something to look forward to. And so here we are in beautiful Hawaii. And the first day we go snorkeling around this beautiful bay. And it looked like something in a postcard. And we got the, when you go snorkeling, you breathe through that tube. It took me a while to get the hang of that, but I did. And you wear those fins, which give you a lot of kicking power. Well, in Hawaii, there are coral rocks on the bottom and the edges of the ocean. So I kicked one of those rocks with my fin and kicked it off. And I was kind of far out at the mouth of the bay where it opens to the ocean. And the current was pretty strong. And without my fin, it was very strong. And I mean, it became a life or death situation where I was gulping water and I was going under and coming up and going under and yelling help. And I saw this coral rock like over near the edge of the bay. So I swam over to it and climbed up on it. But as you may know, coral is sharp and it was cutting my hands and my feet and they were bleeding. And I saw this sailboat in the middle of the bay and I thought it was a better idea to swim to the sailboat. So I swam after what seemed like the longest swim in my life to the sailboat, hung over the side, bleeding, yelling, help. And this man came up and he rowed me to shore in a little canoe where I reconnected with my brother. But it wasn't till I got home, Jimmy. Needless to say, I didn't go snorkeling again. But when I got home, I thought, wait a minute. Less than 6 months earlier, I tried to end my life. And here I was fighting really hard to live. Mm-hmm. Why did I do that? Why didn't I just go under the water and finish what I started? And it occurred to me that I wanted to live, that my innate instinct was to live, and that all this chatter in my head had been convincing me that I wanted to die and that life wasn't worth living. And that I had control over that voice in my head and I could decide if I wanted to live or I wanted to die. And I decided I wanted to live. And from that point on, I started acting like it. And I learned everything I could about rehabilitating my brain. And I set about doing that and recovering.
That's awesome. And so I understand that you underwent really extensive rehabilitation. But as you just mentioned, not only did you do a lot of rehabilitation, like I read about hyperbaric chambers and all these things that you did to help you recover, but you also had to rehabilitate your brain. And I saw you make reference to rewire your brain is something that you wrote. And this is a quote from you. You said, "The brain injury forced me to make radical changes in my lifestyle and mindset that I'd needed to make long before." And you also made reference to a clean slate. So it sounds like, you had that injury and all of the years of work that you put in, you managed through all of that now to come out the other side a happier and healthier person.
Exactly. I started a website called thebestbrainpossible.com. And on there, I tell a lot of what I did, but I also educate people about how they can do the same. You don't have to have a brain injury. What I said before, neuroplasticity is like a magic wand, that we all have that allows us to change our brains. We've got this incredible machine in our heads, and we read the user manual for our iPhones, for our TVs, but we never even learn anything about this thing in our head. But if anybody takes the time to learn, you can rewire your brain. A lot of the patterns, your thinking patterns, depression is basically a learned brain pattern. I'm not saying it's not real and it's not physical. Your brain affects your physiology, and your physiology affects your brain. It's a loop. But you can interrupt that, and you can change your patterns with this thing that I've referred to earlier called neuroplasticity. I've got a blog on my website called The 10 Fundamentals of Rewiring Your Brain. And that basically tells the conditions and the requirements for encouraging neuroplasticity. Sometimes we change our brains unknowingly, like bad habits. Addictions are neuroplastic processes. So a lot of times you can change your brain without knowing it. But if you want to do it knowingly, it will help you to have the right conditions.
Well, something interesting that I read about you, when you first went public with your story and you started telling details about your story, I understand that you gave more detail than maybe you would have wanted to because of your brain injury and because of a lack of social awareness. And then later on, when you had recovered a little bit more and you went back and looked at some of the stuff that you had talked about, you were shocked at how much detail you had given. Is that true that you went back and saw some of this stuff and you were like, I can't believe I said that?
Yes, because Jimmy, what a brain injury, like I said, starting from scratch. What a brain injury does is for me, it took away like all those social norms and what is polite and self-consciousness. That is all learned. That is learned from our parents, from school, from society, from church. Think about a kid. A kid doesn't have those filters. They get out there and dance. They make silly faces. They're not self-conscious. And that's how it was at first. Even it took years for that to even come. I mean, it slowly built. But I wrote the book in the second, third years, probably mostly the third, after the brain injury. And all those filters had not completely come back yet. Mm-hmm. So now I go back and read it, and I'm like, oh my gosh. But I'm glad I wrote it when I didn't have those filters, because one of the things that people say most often about it is how honest it is. And what we all have to do to be ourselves and accept ourselves is be honest with ourselves and each other. And what I realized way back when is if I'm honest about all my mistakes, all my screw-ups, then it allows others the permission to feel like they can be honest. I'm even okay with people thinking, well, if she screwed up that bad, then maybe I'm not so bad off.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, I'm a big believer in finding an outlet in order to kind of channel grief into something positive. And when I look at your story, I mean, not only did you write your memoir, and I'll give the full title. The full title is Sex, Suicide, and Serotonin, Taking Myself Apart, Putting Myself Back Together.
I can even show the book.
There you go. There it is right there. Yeah. So not only did you write your memoir, but as you mentioned, you've got your website, thebestbrainpossible.com. You have a Facebook group with almost 100,000 followers. You've become an inspiration to a lot of people. You've become a voice for the mental health community. Could you have ever envisioned that all of that would come as a result of this incident and the brain injury? And this whole journey that you've taken?
Absolutely not. Not in my old thinking, but in the way I think now and what I've learned is that failure is part of a success. Failure or mistakes are just lessons in disguise. And you never really fail if you learn. And you take whatever happens and you look at it and you say, okay, what can I learn from this? And how do I make this work for me to go forward? And I don't invite adversity, but I know that anything life throws at me, I can handle now because I have the coping skills. And largely all that is a way of thinking. And I'm not saying that anybody can miraculously just think positive all the time or not feel grief or not feel depression or negative thoughts. You're going to feel those. It's normal, but you don't have to fight them. You don't have to believe them, and you don't have to act on them. There is a moment in between things popping in your head, random thoughts. Those come from our subconscious, our wounds. We do not have control over them. But there's a moment, awareness, where you go, okay, that's what I'm thinking. Do I want to believe that? Is that thought helping me? What do I want to say to myself to encourage and support myself instead of that thought? Or how could I reframe that? Is that true? I think the biggest thing that I've learned is that you don't have to believe everything you think, and that you can guide your thoughts and your mind to support and encourage you. And that makes all the difference in life.
Great. And how's your health today?
Oh, very good.
Good. So your recovery has gone really well. And I don't know if you say that you're 100% back to normal. Is that a fair thing to say, or?
Well, I don't think after a brain injury, it's fair for anybody to expect to be 100% back to where they were.
Right.
I'm 100% me. And there are some things that are better, and there are some things that are worse. My handwriting will never be the same. My speaking will never be the same. But like I said, they're trade-offs. I'm a much happier, mentally healthier person now than I was before.
That's
so
great.
I think best we can strive for after any kind of devastating life event, whether it's grief or an injury or anything, is a new normal, a new 100%.
Sure. And in this digital age, I never write. So my handwriting is terrible, anyway. So I don't think it's anything you're losing.
Well, think about it. I mean, you spend all those years in school writing, and I can write again, but I started with like a dry erase board like the kindergartners do.
Yeah.
But I mean, it would take years of writing again to get to where I was. So, I mean, it kind of looks like a second graders, but I mean, at least I can write a check.
That's all that matters. Well, Debbie's memoir, again, is called Sex, Suicide, and Serotonin. It's available on Amazon. And check out her website, thebestbrainpossible.com. And we've been talking to Debbie Hampton. It's really been a pleasure. It's been great to talk to you.
Thank you, Jimmy. I appreciate it.